do it?
I don't.
I'll let you go. You want to arm wrestle?
We'll find it out.
You've been
Sure,
the lead,
I'll
so
do it.
I'm
You
fine.
can introduce me. My name's Lyra.
Lyra? Okay, Lyra. Lyra.
It's okay.
You know
Now
what that is
everyone.
in Turkey?
Hmm?
Well, in most of the world, what lira is money, right?
In Italy, it used to be.
Yeah.
Or a musical instrument.
Yeah, that's.
It's spelled. My name's spelled with a Y, not an I. So technically
Oh,
it is
okay.
different.
Okay. Well, it's still money in Turkey.
Is it still in Turkey? I thought they used to. No. Huh?
It's all money.
Yeah, it's not current anymore.
How close are we, DJ?
I'm supposed to know.
Is it 12?
There you go.
It's 12 now? Yep. Okay, it's 12 o'clock. And so we can start. Oh, there's still people pouring in.
Oh no.
Well, that's why I
Everyone's
always
too
talk for a
timely.
couple seconds ahead of time, okay? So, welcome to the Josephy Center. I'm Rich Wanschneider, and I live upstairs in the library, and I'm responsible for the exhibits that deal with Indians often. And there's an exhibit up there when you get time on Nez Perce treaties and reservations. We had to shrink it down. It was our last big exhibit here, but it's up there. There's also a permanent exhibit on the Wallowa or the Joseph Band of the Nez Perce with a wonderful map that Rob Kemp did that jumps off the wall up there. It's in Nez Perce in English, and we're going to have, we've got copies coming that are about, the size to put on your wall. Okay? So, that said, it's a real pleasure to cooperate with Wallowa Resources. We do it as often as we can, and it's a real pleasure to introduce the Hawk program, because Leslie will remember my granddaughter Oriana was a Hawk intern a few years ago, 4 or 5 or 6 years ago. How many?
Oh goodness, I don't know.
I don't know.
Track of numbers at this point.
Okay. At any rate, so I'm going to let Lyra introduce the program and the interns. Enjoy.
Awesome. Well,
Mike.
I'm not very official, but these guys are going to get a chance to introduce themselves. But the Hawk program, I've had the privilege to lead it for the last 8 weeks, and I really couldn't have asked for a better group of teens to spend the summer with. And I'm really excited for you all to get to hear a little bit about what they've been up to. And I hope you enjoy the presentation.
All right, thank you all for coming. I guess we'll get started. So we are the Hawk program out of Wallowa Resources. Hawk meaning High School Apprenticeship Work Program. It's a great acronym. It's an 8-week paid internship. We get great experiences and opportunities to learn about different careers in natural resources.
So I'm Rosemary Fields. I'm going to be a senior at Enterprise High School. I love the outdoors, so that's a big part of why I applied for this internship. And I'm hoping to pursue a career involving natural resources as well.
I'm Willie Gibbs. I'll be a senior at Wallowa. I really love playing sports and being active, and this was a great opportunity to be able to do that while getting some work in and learning some really valuable things.
My name's Brianna Fairchild. I'm a junior at Enterprise High School. I love to hike and be outside. My indoor hobbies include music and art. I wanted to be in this internship so I could spend more time outside and learn about the outdoors, and now I know that I want a plant-related natural resources career.
I'm Storm Lynch. I'll be a junior this fall up at Joseph. I love just about anything outdoors, so I figured a outdoor-based internship would be a good deal.
So throughout this internship, we kind of focused each week on a different topic of natural resources, and one of our major ones was watersheds. So as you can see, a watershed is any surface from which runoff resulting from rainfall is collected. So that's things like lake, rivers. So a big part of our watershed studies project coordinator for the Grand Model Watershed. Quite the title, but so we were able to go out to the old Doug McDaniel site with him, and then we were also able to go out with Montana Pagano, who is a fish biologist for the Nez Perce tribe, and we went to the Tanflick site in Wallowa. So both these sites are undergoing restoration because a long time ago, humans rerouted the river to make it more straight, so they can make irrigating their crops easier, but they didn't really think about the effects that this would have on the ecosystem of the river. And we've learned that it's been negative, so that's why we're restoring them. This restoration involves making the river have more bends in it, putting in more side channels for the river, and then also putting in wooden structures into the banks of the river. So there's a lot of benefits of doing these things. The first one is to create fish habitat. So fish don't really like fast-moving water. They like slower water. They like colder water as well. So by putting in the bends of the river, it slows it down so there's less ripples. The side channels is also slower water for them. And then the wooden structures in the river slow it down, as well as creating shade for fish to rest in. The second thing is to improve the soil health. So the wooden structures build up sediment from the river, which is really rich in nutrients. So then that spreads out into the surrounding soil, which in turn increases the riparian vegetation of the area. And finally is to recharge the water table. So by putting in these wooden structures into the banks, when the water floods out into the soil, it's actually held there for longer. It doesn't just seep back out into the river. And when it's in the ground, it's able to keep cool. So when it does eventually go back out into the river, it's colder, which the fish also really like. So the second thing we did with water is water management. So we went out with David Bates, who is the water master for Wallowa County. And he sort of took us on a crazy day. We went and learned about water rights. So how water rights work in the West is basically the more senior your water right is, so the earlier that it was established, the more priority your water rights have. Vice versa, the more junior your water right. So David's job is sort of to coordinate and make sure that everyone's using the right amount of water that they're allowed to use. He's obviously had a really crazy year this summer because of the drought. We were also able to work with Woody Wolf, who's a landowner here, and he explained to us why he chose to use pivots as his irrigation method. It's a lot more efficient in the use of his water, and you also use less water. So that's a big reason for him why he chose to do pivots. And finally, another benefit of keeping our watersheds healthy is the recreation that we do in them. So in terms of the water restoration, it brings more fish habitat, so there's more fish, which means better fishing. Just keeping our areas clean and healthy means better boating and swimming as well. So there's a ton of benefits.
Another major part of our summer was forest monitoring. In a joint effort with the Forest Service, we were selected to monitor an area out of Table Mountain in the lower Joseph Canyon area. Or sorry, not Joseph Canyon, just the lower Joseph area. We are collecting baseline data to be sent off to different groups. It will be used in the future, basically to improve our landscape's health and, our communities.
So during our monitoring, we collected a various amount of information, whether it be fuels, the amount of trees, the health, and the amount of regeneration within those areas. And particularly the fuels has a very significant tie-in to fire. The information that we gather gets sent out to various groups, and they can determine what's left and what isn't to give the forest its most healthy look. Some of the methods that we use to thin out, most primarily is hand crews with either chainsaws, and they pile up the debris and either burn it or move it out with equipment.
So the fire aspect of forest monitoring also has a tie into wildlife because the dead trees in the forest are called snags, and they can pose a fire risk, but they're also a good source of habitat for wildlife. Like insects like to live in the trees, birds nest in the trees and weasels den in the trees, and the birds that live in the trees like to eat the insects. So there's a large variety of wildlife that likes to live in these snags. And so it's a judgment call for the Forest Service to make about whether the snag should be left alone or whether it should be removed from the forest. And that's why we classify the snags in decay classes. So with a higher decay class, if it's all rotten and broken down, it's too much of a risk and nothing can live in it, so they remove it from the forest. And if it's a lower decay class, like decay class 1, and it's still standing, still stable, things can still live in it, then they leave it alone so it can continue to be habitat. And another part of wildlife that ties into forestry is the living foliage that lives on the ground floor. So the grasses, forbs, that serves as a food source for wildlife, and it also provides information about what kind of ecosystem the forest is. So we are sure to keep track of that in the site description of the forest manual.
So as both Brian and Storm talked about, we get details about the forest. Like I said before, we were contracted. It's a joint effort. Lots of different groups get the information. We get to decide what to do with it. So as I said before, we are the first year's data. This is just a baseline. It's going to be treated and then monitored again.
Yeah, so as Willie's been saying, the main use of our data is to be able to compare it to 5 years from now after they've done treatment to see how effective the treatment was. And when we're referring to treatment, we're usually meaning thinning the forest, so cutting down some of the trees. And there's a lot of benefits to this. Some of them including it lets in more light for the remaining trees. And then it also lets in more light for the understory beneath. And then there's also fire benefits as well, because the trees aren't so closely packed together. There's a lot less chance of the fire spreading as quickly or turning into a canopy fire. Then there's also the economic benefits of thinning. The contractors have to be hired, which creates jobs, and then the wood will be sold as lumber. And finally, since the light is let in, the understory is healthier, so for ranchers who are raising their cattle in that area, their cattle will have a greater supply.
So for one of our weeks, we went out to the Salt Creek Summit at the Target Springs area with Jerry from the Forest Service, as well as a whole bunch of other employees of the Forest Service. And we were looking at aspen regeneration. Aspen is a tree in the willow family that grows in groups called stands, and that's one of the ways you can identify an aspen, is if you see one really tall aspen tree surrounded by a whole bunch of little ones. And by looking at the bark, you can see that it's white, and the shape of the leaves is circular, and they also tremble even in the slightest breeze. What makes aspen so unique is that sprouts grow out of the root system. Most trees reproduce by seeds, which is what something aspen can do, but it doesn't usually because it's a lot easier to grow sprouts out of the root system. And because it reproduces like this means that all of these little sprouts are genetically identical to the one adult tree. And aspen is important, for one, because it's really pretty. Look at the tree, it's pretty. But for importance, it's an important food source for insects. And it's important that we bring up the insect populations because they've been declining in recent years. And these insects can be a food source for birds, which also live in the trees. Aspen populations have been declining in recent years, and we call that sudden aspen decline. And we don't know for sure what exactly is making the aspen populations drop, but there are a number of theories. The first one is that the droughts have been weakening the root systems. Because when there's drought, it forms blockages in the root systems. It makes it harder to transport water. So that could be killing off the trees. And also, when the sprouts are first growing out of the soil before they get a chance to establish themselves, they can get overgrazed by cattle and deer and elk. And the other theory is that the lack of genetic diversity in the stand can make the trees more susceptible to illness and climate change. One way we can help preserve aspen is by building exposures, which you can see us doing in this picture. And there are a number of different fences that we can use to build exposures. One of them is a wire fence, which is a lot cheaper and easier to work with, but we try not to use that too much because it throws off birds if they crash into it. So when it's affordable, we like to use buck and pole fences, which are wooden poles intersecting in an X and then connected with other wooden poles. It's a lot safer for the birds, a lot more effective. And once the enclosure is built, the small conifers inside get removed so that the only competition within the enclosure is between the aspens, no conifers involved. And if the conifers are big enough, then they can shield all the little sprouts that didn't get included in the enclosure. Also within the enclosure, we can do monitoring work similar to our forest monitoring, but also different because we don't take the measurements on the aspens, we count the number of them. And we also draw a sketch of the site, provide a site description, and take pictures within the enclosure.
So I'm sure we're all pretty familiar with wildland fire these days. However, I'm sure some of you aren't as familiar with Firewise. Firewise is a nationwide organization that encourages people to make their house more fire resistant, remove fuel sources, and essentially lower the risk of fire risk. So to be a bit more specific, they have defensible areas. So the first few inches touching your wall to the first 5 feet out should have no fuel sources whatsoever. 30 feet up from the house follows a lean and green rule, which essentially it shouldn't be dead and shouldn't be easily ignitable. The following 70 feet out to 100 feet should be, there can be structures that are ignitable, but it's kind of with the acceptance that they might catch on fire and burn, but it won't burn down your household. There's lots of different types of Firewise housing. Despite common belief, log homes are actually fairly fire resistant, particularly wide diameter logs. They take close to a half an hour of constant flame for them to ignite. Slightly less preferable to that is wooden siding and shake shingle roofs. Due to them being thinner diameter, they're much more easily ignitable. On the more positive side, metal sheet roofing is very preferable. Some metal sheet roofing has hips, which is where the roof kind of raises up. And they can be poured straight into the insulation, sawdust, and kind of leftover particulate from construction or other damages like woodpeckers. Management for Firewise housing is just making sure that your house is clear of any ignitable sources. One thing that we learned is most houses catch on fire from the inside out. So wherever you may see pine needles or leaves or debris kind of gathering around your household is where the embers and fire greens will land. So you got to make sure those areas are clear, otherwise they will ignite essentially on your house. Frequently people have firewood pressed up against their house or on their porch, and what we learned is you can pick and choose what you choose to do in the case of evacuation in stage 2, but you can leave it on there, but in the event when there is a fire crawling through, or not through, that's a little bit too late. But, far enough away that it's of concern, toss the firewood off the side of the house, pulling mats, and anything else that would catch on fire, such as furniture. So mitigation, as mentioned, for both wildland forests and communities is just making sure that there isn't a substantial amount of fuel that can superheat a fire and create a canopy fire that can just, ravage neighborhoods even if they are Firewise. Just making sure there isn't a substantial heat source, cleaning out dead trees, and any fire path up to a household or bigger tree stand. So during our internship, we went to the Lostine Canyon community and the lake community. The Lostine Canyon community is the first Firewise certified. As a community, they're fairly fire focused, and most of the residents there are permanent. So they have a bit more importance over their homes, I guess, compared to the people that are there only half of the year. However, hence the name, Lostine Canyon. One of the complications of that community is that it's surrounded by very steep walls. So a 20-foot tree could ignite a 100-foot tree, and canopy fires are very probable. Access is also challenging due to a small bridge. The road is wide enough for most of it to get a fire truck through, but then it pinches to a bridge, which could be a clog in terms of evacuation or bringing in fire suppression vehicles. On the other end of the spectrum is the Wallowa Lake community. Due to more people only being there half of the year, there isn't as much importance. And compared to fuel loads being firewood or a brush pile, fuel loads would be somebody else's house. They're so tightly constructed that if somebody's house was to ignite, it can be hot enough to ignite a house from further away or debris. and also due to the nature of how it was built, the power lines and sheds and whatnot made it very difficult to remove trees.
We spent another week on rangeland management. We were out on the Zumwalt Prairie, both with the Nature Conservancy and Kelly Berkmeyer. So rangeland management is a professional natural science involving conservation, protection, and the study of rangelands.
One major part of rangeland management is controlling invasive weeds, and the one that we were monitoring out on the Zumwalt was Medusa head rye, which is an invasive weed from the Mediterranean. And it's a huge problem in the United States because it doesn't get eaten by any of the livestock or other grazers here because of its high silica content, so it's basically like eating glass. It also has low nutritional value, and it's got spikes on it, as you can see in the picture, so it pokes them when they try to eat it. And so because it's not all getting eaten by livestock, it all builds up, and then when it dies, it creates a thatch, which is when all the dead plants lie on the ground and then prevent the desirable plant seed from germinating. We also look for jointed goat grass, which is pretty hard to detect because it looks similar to a native grass that grows out on the Zumwalt. The only difference being that the jointed goat grass has antenna-like structures on it. It looks like a piece of grass with antenna. And it's pretty hard to see, and it's pretty hard to detect because when you're looking on the side of the road on the Zumwalt, when we were looking at the native grass, it was pretty hard to tell against all the jointed goat grass. And the removal strategy that we use to remove the Medusa head rye, you can see us practicing in this picture. So we'd get onto our site and then spread about 15 paces apart and then walk in a straight line until we would find a patch of Medusa head rye. Then we'd mark it with a GPS so that the teams who spray chemicals can come by and know exactly where to spray the chemicals to remove the rye. This is just one of many removal strategies. There are so many removal strategies because there's not one surefire way that works. So one is the chemical strategy. Another is just hand pulling the weeds in areas where they are sparse and not like a whole bunch of them. And the other strategy, which is a last resort, is bringing in a biological agent, which is an animal that would eat the plant in its natural environment. But the problem with that is then the animals can get out of control and invasive. So to prevent the spread of invasive weeds, it's important when you travel to check your boots and your car, and if you go on the water, check your boat to make sure there's no invasive snails on there, so you can prevent the spread of invasive species.
What Brianna's saying about invasive species ties into grazing, which is super prominent here in the county. We have many ranchers and farmers. The Zumwalt Prairie is 300,000 acres of grasslands, native grasses that have been grazed for generations. The grasses have evolved with grazing, so when they're grazed, it stimulates growth and they come back really strong. So as Brianna was saying, the problem with the Medusa head is, for one thing, it takes up ground. Kelly Berkmeyer told us she allots 3 acres per head in the summer, and this year she has to allot 10 acres per head with her cattle. The Nature Conservancy comes up with a plan every year for grazing on the Zumwalt. They own 33,000 acres, and they come up with a map. They section different places off and allow ranchers in the community to come and graze their livestock on it throughout the summer.
We didn't spend a week on native plants, but we did spend a day down at the Hurricane Creek Trail identifying native plants with Lindsay Miller. Now we learned how to identify a large number of plants, too many to mention here, so I'll just cover the most important ones with the medicinal uses. First up we have yarrow, and it has a unique U-shaped flower, and the leaves, you can see them in that picture. So when you pick the leaves and rub them between your fingers, it has a really nice smell, so that's how you can identify it. And the leaves don't just smell nice, they also can stop bleeding, so if you don't have any bandages when you're out in the woods, you can use a yarrow leaf. Next plant is a mullein, which has a long stalk and fuzzy leaves, and these leaves can be rolled into inhalers if that is needed. Oregon grape, our state flower, has antibacterial properties in its roots. So if you dig up the plant and you cut open the root, you can see that it's bright yellow, and a tea can be made out of it that has antibacterial properties. The last plant I'm talking about is the wild rose, and there's a part of the rose plant called the hip, and it contains vitamin C. So if you're ever congested out on the trail and need vitamin C, you can make a tea out of it. So obviously, native plant ID can be important because then you'll be able to tell the difference between toxic and harmful plants from the plants that aren't really going to do anything, from the plants that are edible and have medicinal uses. And it's also important to know which plants have which uses, because there's a story that Lindsay likes to tell us about how she hears people using mullein leaves for toilet paper, which is bad because the leaves are fuzzy and irritating. There's a better plant for that, the thimbleberry, and you can identify that because of its large leaves. And so that's why it's important to know which plants have which uses. And this situation is not life-threatening, but it is a sentimental reason to know native plant ID. It's so that you can feel more connected to the land. You look out the window and you see a tree, you don't know what it is. You see a sea of grasses, you don't know what they are. But if you know how to identify the native plants, you can know what each one is called and what it can be used for, you feel a deeper connection to the land.
So during our third or fourth week of our internship, we did trail maintenance with Ashley Humphreys up on the Falls Creek Trail. So during those 2 days of maintenance, we went roughly 1.5 to 2 miles up the trail and did brush work. So any vegetation that was overgrown and getting to the trail, we cleared out of the way. I'd also taken it upon myself to cut down a tree, which I later regretted. So the value and importance of having clear trails and well-managed trails, I don't think can be understated. As you can see up on the board, the economy that we have just with the Wallowa Whitman is pretty substantial. And having easy access and easy follow trails for people like me who somehow miss a switchback and go quarter mile off trail is very convenient.
Another huge part of our program is environmental education, and one reason for that being we are an environmental education program. So not only are we working in these fields, but we're also learning very valuable things about it and getting an insight if we decide we want to go into those careers. So one of the things we helped with was the run camp with Emily.
So during this rent camp, we taught various things, primarily being the Leave No Trace principles. We also taught tarp structures and a bunch of other activities to familiarize these middle schoolers with the outdoors. If you folks wouldn't mind, we think it'd be kind of fun to teach you those 7 principles. You just want to hallway them out so we don't feel like.
Yeah.
Okay.
First Leave No Trace principle is to plan ahead and learn about an area before you go.
The second one is to camp and walk on durable surfaces.
The third is to dispose of waste properly, which is taking a shovel, scooping out a cat hole.
The fourth is to leave what you find, so take a picture.
The fifth is to be careful with fire by keeping it in the fire ring and making sure it's completely out before you leave.
The sixth is to respect all the wildlife.
And 7 is a peace sign and a wave, and it's to respect other people. And also during this camp, we taught the different principles. Briefly, we'll each mention what they were. I taught about the third principle, more specifically paperwork in the woods, which some of you may know.
I taught about how not to set up a campsite, so make sure you're following the 7 principles when you're setting up camp.
I led a charades activity which covered all 7 of the principles and allowed the kids to demonstrate how well they knew them.
Another huge aspect at Wallowa Resources is the Watershed Festival. So different groups come together, such as Fish Trap, the Nez-Perce, and Wallowa Resources. It is held at the Fairgrounds and Enterprise. It's fun activities balanced with teaching children about basically being safe and keeping our community healthy. Unfortunately, this year, due to the pandemic, we weren't able to do it, so we did the Watershed Festival to go. We filled these goodie bags with fun activities to trick kids into learning.
So the importance of making sure that middle schoolers, high schoolers, of any age group of people who use the outdoors, who recreate, making sure they're educated on how to minimize their impact and keep those natural resources clean, accessible, and a gorgeous place for generations to come is very crucial.
So finally, we just want to say thank you to all the people who made this program possible. You guys might not know, but we were actually given lunch every day, which is pretty cool. So all of our food vendors, thank you to them. And then also the community partners who took us out each day, every week, who took time on their work days. We would not have learned nearly as much as we did without them. So a huge thank you to them. And then finally, our funders. This program would have been possible without them, so we really appreciate them as well.
So my biggest takeaway from this internship is I learned a lot of information that was very key to my character. I learned about not only what I want after high school, but also what I want to get out of high school, which was always something I was questioning since my first day. And not only that, I have a lot more information on what I want as a career afterwards and all of my options, which was challenging to say the least.
When I first started this internship, I had no idea what it takes to work in natural resources, but being able to go out in the field every day and get that experience hands-on is what allowed me to gain some insight into what each of these careers would be like on a day-to-day basis. And this allowed me to accomplish my goal of narrowing down my interests to what careers I'd be interested in. And I figured out that I like forestry and botany because of this program.
Just like Brandon was saying, we set goals at the beginning of our internship, and I've been thinking really heavily about those. I'm happy to say I've really been able to accomplish them while gaining super valuable information and experience. I've definitely broadened my horizons when it comes to thinking about career opportunities.
Yeah, I also just feel way more connected to my community now. Every day we went out and met different people, and it was just really cool to see how everyone here communicates and works together to accomplish their goals. I also have a way better understanding of the variety and the broad amount of careers that there are out there, and what it takes to be able to do them. So yeah, it's been great.
So thank you all once again for coming, and we will have the time for questions, but before that, I just want to have one more special thank you. Thank you, Lyra, for dealing with us every day and taking us out. Could we please get a round of applause for Lyra? Thank you. Any questions?
Can we get a round of
Also, thanks to you folks for coming out on a Wednesday afternoon.
I got a question. What was your favorite field day that you went out on?
Ooh, we've talked about this one a lot.
Well, I would say my favorite field day was probably going down to Camplex. We collected 200 willow cuttings that planted in the ground, and it was super cool to see my community kind of taking charge and fixing our past mistakes.
I'd have to say I really enjoyed the forest monitoring days. Tromping around in the woods is always a great time, especially for me. And I'd have to say if I pick one though, building analog beaver dams with Ian Wilson was super fun. We basically got paid to just muck around in some water and branches and be little kids for a bit.
Analog beaver dam is supposed to digital beaver dam?
Analog
What's that
beaver
mean?
dams is when they're basically like faux beaver dams. Since we don't hear, we go in to add them. It slows down the water current, kind of forces the water back into the ground, cools it down, as Rosie had mentioned earlier.
Yeah, analog as in like an analogy, so like similar to a beaver dam, not like a big, yeah. But yeah, I would have to agree with Storm, the forest monitoring, and then beaver dam day was really cool. Just all of it was really awesome.
So I liked all of the forest monitoring days, but if I had to pick one specific day, it would be the Native Plants Day because we got to go down to the Hurricane Creek Trail and just spend the day learning about different kinds of plants and going for a hike.
Alright. Any other questions?
Any other questions?
Yes, so there's aspen that we you don't have genetic diversity, and since they clone and grow up, how do you reestablish diversity? You know, did you do any analysis of how one clump is related to another? Have we got some diversity already out there?
So we did talk about it a little bit. So as Brianna mentioned, they do have the ability to seed. Most plants or trees, have a male part and a female part, so they can self-seed, self-germinate. With aspen, they only have one gender. So you have a male tree or a female tree. So if those two, are near each other, they can produce seed, and it will spread and create genetic diversity. Another thing you can do is you can cut sections of root and plant them in other places. It's hard to really get it to sprout, and it's very costly. So if you can find a male and a female, you can try to get them to procreate, but it is extremely difficult.
Yeah. Essentially, the complication is that with the aspen that we have, they're so far spread apart, they don't have the ability to reproduce that way.
So it's impressive. I mean, thank you all for taking this program on. I mean, I've known of the program for a lot of years, but to hear firsthand experiences is great. You guys covered a ton of stuff in 8 weeks, and I'm curious to hear from one or more of you what you think perhaps like the thorniest challenge is, or the thorniest sort of problem that that we face in natural resources.
So personally for me, I'm an angler, so I consistently think about water. And the water shortages that we're facing in the West seem to be kind of a prominent reoccurring issue, whether it was agriculture of any variety, wildlife, and just we have so many species that are kind of retracting, like salmon, like the aspen trees. It's very difficult to reintroduce what was its preferable climate when it's a challenge as big as a water shortage.
One thing I'll say about that following storm is in almost every field we covered this year, we were told there is no solution. So the job is figure it out, problem solve. Okay, this doesn't work, try this, did that work, and that's why recording is so important. It's pretty much, figuring it out. There's no, we do this because it works. It's finding out what can happen, what does happen when we do things.
Yeah, so kind of to add on to that, another thing more like socio-political focused is it's very difficult to get everybody's interests aligned with one single plan. Like for me, I might just want to say, the ranchers and the farmers, they don't get any water because I like better fishing. But Willie, who raises cattle and his family does, that would be ruining his family's livelihood. So it's very challenging to get everybody on the same page, and also getting the hands, the resources, and just the ability to do those things is very challenging.
Also, it involves a lot of work with landowners, and sometimes when the crews go out to try and get permission to work on their land, the landowners don't like it because it's too expensive to hire all the labor and let people work on their land. So the cost is a huge problem when working with natural resources.
Yeah, the kind of one consistency we saw with almost everything is people are very afraid of initial cost. Even if it benefits them in the long run, either they won't have the resources to do that, or it's very intimidating for them to invest so much without completely positive, almost insurance afterwards. You guys have any? Any other questions?
So, one of the goals of the program is in growing not just better land, but better people in the land. And it'd be great if every single person in high school would take the Wild Resources program, but we can't do that. So, how do you guys see moving on from this in terms of how you're going to be an element in your communities?
That's a really good question. So like one small thing that I can do is just educate from what I learned from this program. It could be as small as, like for example, the Leave No Trace thing. It always surprises me how many people, after they go to the bathroom in the woods, they just leave their toilet paper. They think it's fine. So if I can educate them and tell them that it's actually harmful, it takes a while to decompose, that's just one small little thing. So if it has to do something with using water or range limit management or forest monitoring, that can make a really big impact. I think Willie talked about it briefly. If you can just, almost like a butterfly effect, where if you can just start here and then tell another person, second person, and they go tell people, it can make a really broad impact. But really, I brushed over it a little quickly, but environmental education is, our best friend with managing our natural resources, just because it's not that people have ill intentions, it's just frequently they don't understand or have misunderstandings of what's helpful and what they can do or what they're doing that's actually harmful.
And with the Firewise communities, one thing that's important is leading by example. So like, if somebody decides to participate in a Firewise community and get their house better prepared for a fire season that their neighbor won't want to, then that one person getting it done, and then if other people do, then that one person who didn't will see all these examples and think, oh, maybe I should do that too. And then the whole community will be planted.
And another thing, I think for all of us, this program has made us realize that we do want a career in natural resources. So not only are we going to just be spreading this information throughout our lives, but we're going to be learning more throughout our entire lifetime probably and working to solve these problems. So that's it.
Like being an advocate for resources you care about can also be a very substantial resource. Like again, for me as an angler, if I advocate for issues facing salmon or other species that are struggling with population, I feel very passionate about that, so I'm going to be a very passionate advocate. So whatever it may be, if you're a hunter and you want to see better populations of elk or deer, or if you're a farmer and you want less of that, or just whatever it is you feel passionate about in natural resources, if you can be an advocate for it, you'll be a very prominent one.
I just want to take a moment to say these are 4 extraordinary young people, and Lyra as well. They've not only done an amazing job with the program this summer, but under pretty remarkable circumstances with beyond hot days and smoke and all these other things. They've always done it with a smile and it's been coworkers. So if we could just give them another round of applause.
Any other questions?
Last question?
Alright.
Thank you guys.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
There are drinks over here. If people can, I just go up and ask their individual questions, right?
Thank you.
You pin them down one at a time.
Thank you guys for the questions.
You guys on the spot? I think we can, you guys need a beverage?
And thank you to everybody who came to
The support, thank you. You guys ask hard questions.